'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking
From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring who wrote the Bible. That's right, we have with us Dr. Elliott Friedman. He is Davis Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Georgia. He's going to tell us who wrote the Bible. Welcome to the circle, Dr. Friedman.
Thank you.
Well, I think a lot of people wonder who wrote the Bible. We're going to focus on really the Old Testament, if I'm correct.
Yes.
And I know a lot of people think Moses wrote the first 5 chapters of the Old Testament, the Torah. But before we get to that, a lot of scholars talk about letters. And I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the letters J, P, E, D, besides them being in the alphabet. But what do these letters stand for in relation to who wrote the Bible?
Well, the original questions in the field of the Bible were who wrote it. People saw problems almost as soon as it was done. So for 2,000 years, they looked at questions where one passage seems to contradict another, or where a story is told more than once. And so they're developed over the last couple hundred years. Studies by people from all kinds of backgrounds, priests, rabbis, ministers, people who were religious, people who were very anti-religious, trying to capture why these things were happening. And the hypothesis that developed was that the reason you saw one passage in the 5 books of Moses conflicting with another was they were written by 2 different people. And when you found different stories being told more than once, like Moses hitting a rock and getting water out of it, which happens in Exodus 17, but then it happens again in Numbers 20, or Abraham telling a foreign king his wife Sarah is his sister, which happens in Genesis 12, but then it happens again in Genesis 20. And when you count those up, there's between 25 and 30 of those. And all of these things kept adding up enough that people became persuaded to look for a consistent explanation for all of it. And the consistent explanation was that there are 3 or 4 different texts there originally. There's actually more, but 3 or 4 main ones. And since we didn't know the names of the authors, scholars being scholars came up with signifying letters that stood for them. There was one text that never used God's name. God's name in the Bible is Yahweh. And it was mainly German scholars who started this. And in German, Yahweh would be spelled with a J, not with a Y, the way we do it in English. So they called that the J text or J source. And another source that didn't use the name Yahweh until the book of Exodus was different. That is, all through Genesis, it never called God by his name. And then in Exodus 3, God says to Moses, well, now I'm going to tell you my name is Yahweh, but your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they didn't know that. They thought my name was El. And that was a key piece of evidence, because you look back in Genesis and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all knew the name Yahweh, and they do use it. And that's when they started splitting sources by whether they called God Yahweh all the way through or only starting at Moses. And if you play this out, there's several sources, and they have different attitudes about when God's name became known. And with the words for God, El or Elohim, and the word for God's name, Yahweh, they occur altogether about 2,000 times in the 5 books of Moses. And when you divide the sources by this J source, which calls God Yahweh, and the E source, which calls God Elohim, that's just Hebrew for God, and the 2 other sources that you mentioned, P and D, when you divide it up by this method, you find that out of 2,000 occurrences of the name of God, there's only 3 exceptions where you get the wrong name in the wrong place, which is amazing given that this book, after all, was recorded by hand for for a long time. It wasn't done on a printing press, or you could have everybody have a common text till so much later. So it's a pretty powerful piece of evidence. And then you put it together with all the other evidence. Today we can look at evidence of the language of Hebrew. There are passages in the Bible that are in early Hebrew that looks as different from later Hebrew. Say Shakespeare's English looks from Valley Girl English. I mean, English develops, all languages develop. So that was corroborating evidence, and various other things all came together. So I collected that evidence in that book I wrote called Who Wrote the Bible? And that was in 1987. So it's been around a pretty long time.
And here's the book right here, Dr. Friedman's book, Who Wrote the Bible? A must get if you want to learn more about the Bible. Let me ask you this question. You're mentioning the difference in Hebrew, just like English, Shakespeare's English to the Valley Girl English. Does that change the meaning a lot? Do you think the meaning was altered over those years because of the changing of Hebrew?
The meaning wasn't altered. Sometimes people get confused. People misunderstand a passage because they're just reading it as a common Hebrew that they know, and they don't realize that the Hebrew of the older parts of the Bible means different things. And this is fairly recent scholarship, especially since the 1970s. There's been great research by terrific scholars on the development of the Hebrew language. So that, I'll give you an example. The two oldest things in the Bible, it would appear to be, are songs. It's the Song of Miriam, also called the Song of the Sea, that the Israelites sing when they go through the Red Sea in Exodus. And the other oldest thing in the Bible is the Song of Deborah, which is in Judges chapter 5, which is sung about the judge Deborah after she and the Israelites defeated the Canaanites in the battle that first created Israel as an independent country. And in the Song of Deborah, she's referred to, if you look in most English translations, it says mother in Israel. And you go, oh, isn't that nice? People go, isn't that terrific? She was a great soldier and a warrior and a judge and a prophet. And what do you know? She was a great mom, too. She was a good Jewish mom. She made the best chicken soup in all of Bethel. Isn't that great? But it didn't mean that at all. The word that's translated in there, that preposition in the stage of Hebrew of the Song of Deborah, which is very early, it can mean of, not in. And she's not just any old mother in Israel. She's the mother of Israel. She was the founding mother at the time of the battle that created Israel as a nation. And it was the biblical historian Baruch Halpern is probably the best biblical historian who said she was mother of Israel like George Washington is father of the United States. That's what the term means there. It's a lot more than she was a nice housewife as well as, a warrior. And that's something you wouldn't get unless you knew something about the stages of development of biblical Hebrew and knew that a little thing like a preposition could mean one thing in one period, but 400 years later it means something else. That's significant.
I wonder how many more of those things. That actually brings me to a question that was brought up by a friend of mine who's a student of the Bible. He reads and writes Hebrew. He asked me a question one time, and I don't know if you have an answer or not, but I'd be interested to hear your opinion. He said in the very first verse of Genesis, it says, in the beginning, and everybody knows the first three words. But he says the way that the Hebrew was written, it could mean in a beginning. What do you think about that?
I want to answer this, Carol. He's asking actually it's a technical linguistic point.
Yeah.
The word is what's known in Hebrew as the construct state, where you put two nouns next to each other. I'm going to try to make this as untechnical as possible. Okay? It's been known since, even medieval commentators on the Bible pointed out that that means in the beginning of the creating. And because it's a construct, it wouldn't have this definite article, so which is why I assume he thinks it can't mean that, he thinks it might not mean in the beginning of the creating of the heavens and the earth, but in a beginning of the creating of the heavens and earth, which I suppose would imply there are many creatings of the heavens and the earth. I think there's hardly a chance that the author of that passage was using that form, the construct state, to imply anything like that, or that there's nothing to suggest that the author of that text thought that there were many other creatings prior to that first one. He was into modern theory of Big Bang, Big Crush alternating in an eternal recurrence. There's no other evidence of that kind of thinking then. So both linguistically and just in terms of what we understand of the evidence of what they thought about that sort of thing, I have to say I'm skeptical. I never say 100% wrong. I can't say your friend is 100% wrong, and I'd have to know what he meant, but I'm skeptical.
Well, maybe you guys will have that discussion some other time in the future. It might be fun. So let's go back to this. Did Moses write or not write the Torah? Some people say Moses wrote one part of it. Some people say he only wrote a part of Genesis as well. What did Moses write?
Well, the Hebrew of the Torah is of a period later than Moses lived. If there was a Moses, and if he lived and was, which would be something like 13th century BCE, we don't have not a single inscription of the Hebrew language anywhere from then. And it would be an even earlier stage than what I was talking about in the Song of Miriam and the Song of Deborah. So it's hard to imagine how he could have done that if it did happen. And secondly, it would be hard to imagine why it is that he's writing 9th and 8th and even 5th century BCE Hebrew if he was alive in the 13th century. That the language in which the Torah exists didn't exist when Moses was alive.
Do you think he gave the stories orally then? Do you think he was involved in any way, or do you think these are other people writing stories about him?
All the evidence known to me is that it's other people wrote other parts later, and we can identify when almost all of them lived. We don't know their names, but let me be careful. No critical scholar known to me, no one who is familiar with all of the evidence and how the arguments work and how the evidence is collected, not one known to me on earth thinks Moses wrote the Torah.
Oh, wow.
Now, I understand that people of faith, that's different. The religious, say, fundamentalist or evangelical Christian or an Orthodox Jew, I certainly understand where they're coming from as a matter of faith. They believe that Moses did. But I'm a scholar. I'm not allowed to go that way. I have to go by what the evidence indicates. And all of us who've studied the evidence, as far as I know, see it that way. I've seen attempts by people to try to use the evidence to challenge that, but none of them has so far achieved any kind of respect in the scholarly community.
Since we're on that note, does archaeology corroborate any of the Bible stories that we've heard about, the flood, anything else like that, the 10 plagues? Do you know of anything like that?
No, 10 plagues, no. Archaeology is tremendously significant, and all of us, especially in American biblical scholarship, where Bible and archaeology have gone together since the teacher of my teachers, which was the great William Foxwell Albright, who at Johns Hopkins in the 1950s and 60s and 1940s, he taught all the great many of the great American Bible scholars, and say there's hundreds of us who are the students of his students, and he was both a great archaeologist and a great biblical scholar, and so we all, even those of us who don't do both, respect both. So we follow it. I've been involved in excavations, and most of what I do, though, is textual. But still, it's they go together. But it's not in nice, neat ways like that, where you find a stone that says, Abraham loved Sarah carved in it. I mean, we don't get that. That's in the movies. But in real archaeology, we've now dug between 300 and 500 sites in Israel. It's the most excavated per square foot country in the world. And so what we find is more corroborating everything about the culture and the way of life. It's rare that you find something that's like really specific. Every now and then you get that. You get like the actual signature of somebody, or you get a piece of text from the Bible that you find that's very old. But finding something as nice as, a note from Ramses the Pharaoh to his second in command saying, "Darn that Moses, he did it again. I hate that guy." You don't.
So there's no Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat either, huh?
There was no Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat. There was no Noah's Ark. It's a story.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
That leads me to another question. This is a big debate, you know that. What do you think about the Bible in regards to its compilation of myths or allegories, as some say? We have evidence, if I'm correct, we have evidence like the Epic of Gilgamesh and others that have been written prior to it that have very similar flood stories. What did you learn about that, or what have you discovered during your research?
Well, all of us who do Bible have to do all of that. So, I mean, like my students all have to do 7 or 8 or 9 languages, as I did, because we have to read those Mesopotamian texts about, like, as you mentioned, the Gilgamesh epic and the creation epic from the Near East. And everybody's known for a long time that there are some very obvious parallels between those texts and biblical texts. But they're mainly during the stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, like the prehistory, the primeval history. There's a flood story there that's in the Epic of Gilgamesh that's remarkably similar to the biblical story. I mean, the hero's name is Napishtim, not Noah, but he does. He takes his family on the ark. He takes animals. There, it's not an ark; it's a boat. The Bible's one is not a boat; it's a big box. He has his boat. At the end, he sends out 3 birds, and 2 of the 3 birds are the same as the birds in the Bible. He lands on the mountain. He gets out and offers a sacrifice. The gods smell the sacrifice. So outside the fact that it's plural gods, not one, I mean, there's pretty obvious parallels, and it's a much older story than the Bible. So sure, yes, it influenced the Bible. But you're on talking about the first 11 chapters of the first book of the Bible. After that, the biblical stories give rise to influencing other cultures as much as they're influenced by those cultures. I mean, we didn't get the story of Abraham from Egypt or Mesopotamia. It's its own story. And although the records of the kings of ancient Israel, there's corroboration of that. 15 of the kings mentioned in the Bible are mentioned in some other archaeological source, and every one of them in the right period in those sources. So there you're not talking about taking up some myth from another culture. They're open to the idea of myths from other cultures in the first 11 chapters because they're talking about prehistory. And they did have the idea that, there used to be gods back in those periods. And there used to be wild, crazy things that happened in those days. But they didn't attribute it to their own time.
That's a great point. I never heard that before. I like that light of view. And that's something we're going to talk about towards the end of the show, because the show is about human behavior. It's how we perceive things. And the information from the external environment can change our perceptions, which change our judgments, our decisions, and our future. But before we get to that, and what's your opinion about, does it really matter, after all, finding who wrote the Bible, or does it matter, was it Moses or not? Before we get to that, we're going to talk one more verse that seems to be kind of controversial, and I'd love to have your opinion on it. Again, we talked briefly about it before the show, which was Genesis 6. There's the verse of sons of God, known as the Nephilim, if I'm correct. What are they?
All right, that's one of the hardest sections in the Bible. It's only a few verses long, and it's a story you always leave out in Sunday school because you don't want to tell the kids about that one. They'll never understand what that's about. And what it says is that these B'nai Elohim, which literally means, the children or sons of God, but is the term that means the gods. It's in many places in the ancient Near East in the Bible, the B'nai Elohim are the gods. And these male deities, it says, have sex with the human women. And they give birth to creatures, who are later referred to as giants or Nephilim. They are some sort of extra big people. And then they don't occur again in the Bible until the book of Numbers, where Moses sends these spies into the land before attempting to enter it, and they see them there. They say, "Oh, we saw the Nephilim, those giants there." And then in the book of Joshua, it says he when he tries to conquer Israel, they kill any of these giants that they find, and the only ones that are left are in 3 Philistine cities. And later you get, in the book of Samuel, the story of Goliath fighting David, and he is a Philistine from one of those 3 cities. And so he is seemingly the last remnant of that event that happened between the gods and the human women. And then when David kills him, that's the end of that, and you never hear about them again for the whole rest of the Bible. That is to say, it's a story that's spread across many books of the Bible, and it's an idea of trying to explain why there are some people who are giants. I mean, today we call them, Lakers. In those days, they called them Nephilim. And it's not that surprising. You remember, all across Greek and Near Eastern mythology, there's always stories about where there's sex between a god and a human, and they give birth to somebody who's half and half. And then so Gilgamesh himself was like that, and not Oedipus, but Achilles was like that in Greek. There's often where there's one parent who's divine and one parent who's human, and so the child is sort of a demigod, a superhuman. And you just don't expect a story like that in the Bible, because in the Bible you expect, but it's supposed to be monotheistic. Who the heck are these sons of the gods? But they apparently had a notion that there used to be gods, and there aren't anymore. And if you wanted to get into the specifics of it, the key is Psalm 82. You can have everybody go home as a piece of homework and read Psalm 82, where God condemns all the other gods to death. And so it's understood that originally there may have been gods, but there aren't anymore. And I can't tell you if ancient Israelites really believed it's true and it happened that way, and that the Bible means it literally, or if both the ancient Israelites and the Bible itself mean it just as a myth. It's their myth of the death of the gods. Because that way, when monotheism caught on, and all the ancient Israelite parents started teaching their kids, honey, there's only one God. And the kids said, but Mom, Grandma worshiped lots of gods. Was Grandma bad? And you say, no, Grandma wasn't bad. There used to be gods, but they were bad, and so they all died off, and now there is only one God. Now, did they mean that literally or as a metaphor, a myth? But we don't know.
Wonderful explanation. Again, last question. Does it really matter? What does it do to us knowing this information? And I know some, like you said, do believe in the evidence. They follow that. They follow that the Bible was not written by Moses, or the Genesis was not written by Moses as well. But others do believe in it. Do you think it should harm their faith at all, or to just give them a different perspective on the Bible?
I was deeply concerned about that. When I wrote Who Wrote the Bible, my teacher, Professor Cross at Harvard, I went to him, I said, listen, this is going to put it out very visible. We all always knew this in the academic world. People heard it in their university classes. But if this book is successful, which it did turn out to be, then, I don't want to hurt anybody. And he said, strangely, this very dignified Harvard professor said, you have to do your thing. And by which I took that to mean, a scholar's job is to do a scholar's job, which is to tell the truth. You uncover it wherever you find it and wherever it takes you. And if it makes you uncomfortable, then that's bad, too bad. But I always, in my classes, did the best I could, and in the book itself, and in lectures I give, to be comforting about it, and to tell people, this doesn't have to ruin a person's faith. The authorship of the Bible are only a question about which human wrote it down on the paper, on the parchment. So if it turns out that it was this author of J or the author of P, or not not Moses as the author, the words still say the same thing. And if you believe those words are revealed by God, they can still be revealed by God. If you're God, you can be really good at that. You can reveal to 4 people just as easily as you can to 1. What's the fun of being God if you can't, do that? So most people I've known have not been distressed by it in that way. And I've known a fair number of people who had been raised as quite conservative Christians or Jews who learned about this, and some rejected it and some accepted it. And the ones who accepted it, it didn't ruin their lives. It often meant that there was a period of crisis for them when they were facing a big challenge to the things they believed, but they usually got through it just fine. The person who introduced me to it was my professor when I was in college at the University of Miami, and he had been a conservative Baptist minister. And when he first discovered it, it was major faith crisis for him. But then he later reconciled with it, and he remained in the church and also became a professor of it. And I knew a rabbi in San Diego who same thing, the Jewish equivalent of that. He was raised ultra-Orthodox in Brooklyn. And when he first went to college and learned about all this stuff, this criticism that maybe it wasn't Moses, it was others who wrote the Bible and for other reasons, he went through whatever was the Jewish equivalent of what the Baptist guy had gone through. But he came out on the other side and is still a rabbi to this day, and a very good one. And so all I can say is that I know people who live with it, and it's fine. There are a couple of websites for people who talk about it. There's one called thetorah.com that's very good, where a fair number of Orthodox Jews who also want to consider this criticism and face the evidence wherever it takes them go there. I've written for them a couple of times, and I've heard there are other websites like that and blogs for people who want to argue this out, but it needn't necessarily ruin their lives and destroy their faith or anything like that.
I appreciate the answer. You can tell your authenticity and your concern and care for others. Once again, Dr. Richard Friedman, the book, Who Wrote the Bible? A must get. Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman, for being on The Circle. Thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, even in old Israel, we're there. See you next time, everyone.